Alrighty, so this is the introduction to the Probably series, and in this series, we're going to be covering different technicals and different behavioral questions that you will probably get during your investment banking recruitment process, right? And the reason why it is specifically probably is because I have a series before this that goes into questions that you will definitely get, and those are denoted by a definitely in the top left corner, right? And the way that I have put together these questions was incredibly intentional, right? There are a ton of guides online or a couple hundred questions that you guys might find that essentially just throw a bunch of questions at you, and they don't actually tell you which questions are more important for you to learn than others, right? So you might spend a couple hours trying to understand what the difference between like an operating lease under IFRS versus US GAAP is, right? And that is a question that pretty much no one actually gets when it comes to recruiting. So the way that I have put together these questions is that I'm currently at a target school, and each one of the students that recruit for investment banking, they typically have between 100 and 150 coffee chats, right? And I have essentially compiled every single question that every person got through all of those coffee chats into one document, and I have stack ranked them in terms of what you are most likely to get, all the way down to questions that you are least likely to get. So, starting at the top are questions that you will definitely get, right? And then we move on to questions that you will probably get, right? And then we'll move down and kind of cover more questions that are a bit more nuanced, or questions that you might get, or questions that you are unlikely to get, right? So that's the way that I essentially have this structured. And all of the questions that I have gathered are very, very current. They're as of the last 2 years from like today, right? So you know that these aren't kind of outdated or anything like that. So you're really getting like the most current, the most accurate questions that you have that you can, and it's also kind of the best way to spend your time in terms of when you're actually studying for these investment banking technicals, and also on the behavioral front. I also have it structured so that you go through the definitely series in its entirety first, and then you move on to the probably series. So that kind of causes spaced repetition, and it also allows you to go through a high level of all of the material first, so that in your first coffee chat, if you get asked a question around valuations or around M&A, you aren't sitting there like like kind of like a sitting duck, right? And you don't understand what some basic concepts are in valuations and in M&A, right? And that's also something that a lot of folks kind of struggle with, because they'll start on accounting in these different online resources that they're able to find, and they really learn accounting, and then they get a question on M&A and they don't know how to answer it, right? So I really, really recommend this approach. I think it's really effective overall, and I've seen it work with a couple of people that I've talked to as well, who are kind of re-recruiting. So let's talk about the technicals that I'm going to cover under the probably series in specific, right? So make sure that you're kind of comfortable with the definitely series first, and then we'll hop into these. So you're going to notice under the introduction to finance, we only have one concept that we're going to be covering, and that is, why do different companies have different discount rates, right? We're going to talk about that in the definitely series. We cover a lot more on like the introduction to finance, so not much that's kind of left for this series. When it comes to accounting, and this is also a very, very intentional choice, right? You're going to notice that between the definitely series and the probably series, we didn't really cover a lot of walking individuals through the three statements. We did the $10 of depreciation, and we talked about how the three statements link, right? But we haven't done, oh, how does the sale of inventory look? What does a write down of PP&E look? We're not covering any of that in either one of these two series, because it is crazy how unlikely you are to get a question like that, right? The instances that were present of people being asked questions, essentially asking them to walk through the three financial statements that wasn't depreciation, was so low. And especially once you removed one or two coffee chats, or one or two bankers that asked those specific questions repeatedly in coffee chats, it became even lower, right? It was a minuscule number. So because of that, I'm not going to include that in the definitely or in the probably series very, very intentionally, right? So I would say go through this content first and then go back and learn accounting after that in terms of walking through the three statements for specific line items. Now let's talk about enterprise value and equity value. We did a lot of content in the Definitely series, but we're going to be talking more around why we can't pair enterprise value with net income. We're going to be talking about diluted equity value, RSUs, options, the treasury stock method, the convertible bonds, how to kind of convert that into equity value. We're also going to be talking how different events impact our enterprise value and our equity value. Then moving on to valuations, you actually have a really strong understanding at this point if you've gone through the Definitely series. So we're going to be talking about three more valuation methodologies, how to go from unlevered free cash flow to levered free cash flow and back, kind of going in between the two. I'm also going to cover within every industry group, different verticals have there's certain verticals that have higher and lower betas than the market or in relation to each other. So we're going to be talking about that as well because that's actually a really really common question that I saw. How does it like what does it mean to be an intrinsic valuation methodology that's kind of built into our discounted cash flow? So what does that really mean? Kind of more around like the actual inputs not being market based, right? And then we're going to be talking about if we extend the cash flow forecast period in the DCF, how does that affect valuations, right? Moving on to M&A, we're going to be looking at a purchase price allocation schedule. We're going to be looking at like what a typical premium looks like in an M&A transaction. We're going to be looking at different revenue and cost synergies and looking at, oh, which one is better for a company, right? Are cost synergies better? Are revenue synergies better? Then we're going to be going into merger math, right? So we're going to be talking about is a particular transaction accretive depending on its financing, whether it's cash, stock, debt, right? And how accretive or how dilutive is this transaction? We're going to be looking at a mix of all of those variables, right? And then moving on to that, we're moving on to LBOs, right? So a really common question that was actually asked is what are 10 to 20 factors that affect the valuation or affect the return on an LBO, right? We're also going to be talking about why an LBO gives a floor valuation that kind of might be more tied in with kind of the valuation space up there. We're going to be talking about an ideal LBO candidate and a real life example of an ideal LBO candidate, and then moving on to different LBO calculations. So looking at internal rate of return, money on money multiples, debt financing, exit calculation, stuff like that, right? Now, we're not going to do a full paper LBO because that isn't, it's not, it wasn't common enough for me to deem it as part of this series, but it will likely be a part of the next series, right? And then moving on to the behavioral front, right? We're going to obviously, hopefully, you guys are all strong on the definitely series for the behaviorals because those are the highest value behaviorals. And I would actually do the definitely behaviorals and then the technicals, the definitely technicals and the probably technicals, and then move on to the behaviorals. And that's why I kind of have them in this order. Um, so we're going to be covering a couple of questions that you can kind of answer using the star format, right? Going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to be talking about how a question that's asked actually really, really commonly, and that is how are you going to manage the investment banking lifestyle or the stresses associated with investment banking, right? And then we're going to be talking about where does this bank in particular rank, right? So if you're going to interview with three or four banks, how do you tell each one of the banks where they rank in the process if they ask you that question explicitly, right? So overall, I'm pretty excited for a lot of this content. So hopefully it can be really helpful for you guys. So let's hop into it.